Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Ungar. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Child, Family, and Community Resilience at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada. It's a real pleasure to be able to offer one of these particular talks. Look, as our understanding of the processes of flourishing has become much more culturally and contextually nuanced, I've gotten really interested in these innovative approaches to research and how they're being used to account for, well, frankly, the complex, these reciprocal relationships between the many multiple systems that influence our capacity to thrive, especially when we're under stress. So let me see if I can bring you into my headspace a little bit. Imagine that you live in a town of, say, 7,000 people out in Western Canada that's wholly dependent upon the oil and gas extraction industries. How would you flourish? And indeed, which systems would be most helpful to you coping as, say, economy goes up and down? So what this presentation does, it's going to use results from a longitudinal mixed method study with youth living in communities like this that are experiencing both extreme economic stress and the challenge of shifting identities and indeed social disorganization. This study, called the Resilient Youth in Stressed Environments, or RISE for short, has been a 6-year project with over 1,000 youth ages 13 to 24 in communities that are highly dependent on oil and gas extraction or processing industries in both Canada and South Africa, and indeed with other sites emerging in places like Nigeria and even Russia. So we wanted to look at all dimensions of what makes a young person thrive. So we used longitudinal surveys at 3 different time points, 2018 and 19 and then 20, qualitative interviews with a purposeful sample of respondents, sort of assessing them for both risk exposure as well as flourishing, and sort of got profiles on both sides. We used participatory visual methods. We even collected hair cortisol as a biomarker for stress, and we used GIS, satellite data, as well as macroeconomic data. It's a lot of different systems that we were trying to tackle. So what we got was all kinds of different data, like basically what you're looking at. The orange line is the world price of oil over the years, and indeed that black line is just tracking the average amount of green and blue spaces in this particular community. So what the study was basically tracking was promotive and protective factors associated with well-being in the context of extreme economic downturn, which was essentially had resulted in job losses, pressure to diversify economically, family dislocation, alcohol and drug abuse, and as you can see, a dramatic decrease in the number of spaces that young people could actually just use for informal recreation, basically bogs and waterways and forests and that type of thing. So all of this was taking place amid the possible dislocation of these residents as our dependency on carbon-based energy has been changing, and we're moving towards greener forms of energy to address the climate emergency. And we basically have been talking about all kinds of factors. We were able to track individual biology. I mentioned hair cortisol, psychological processes, measures of mental health and disorder were involved in the study. We tracked peer and caregiver relationships. We talked about work and school engagement, as well as the influence of macroeconomic challenges, the world price of oil. We looked at the quality of these young people's neighborhoods. Was there social cohesion or violence? And even the quality and accessibility of these green and blue spaces, as well as also something that about these active recreation spaces as well. So we had a lot of different dimensions of these young people's lives. Now, very quickly, a little bit of the qualitative findings. This community, what we actually found was that a community needs to change its identity if it's also to accept the diversification of its economy. If you're stuck seeing yourselves as a community just as an oil and gas town, then it's going to be very difficult to think of any other ways to move into a new economic space. We also found that women and men were affected differently by the changes to the economy. And indeed, their career paths change as economies change, their educational decisions, their family patterns of coping, even in fact, just the way they raised their kids, the way they interacted around the dinner table, and indeed the choices that they were making on a day-to-day basis about things that would keep them well, whether that was a recreational opportunity or just whether they'd go to the bar. And the community too changed. We saw basically there are as many liquor stores as there are churches, mosques, and synagogues in this particular town. But there were also shuttered stores, and people reported weird patterns with their family time. In fact, during the economic downturn, they actually reported better family cohesion because families had time to be together as long as one parent didn't have to go away. So all of this gave us lots of data points. So our quantitative findings really echoed the themes in our qualitative work. So employing advances to network analysis, we combined all these different systemic factors into a single quantitative analysis. What that actually shows is that when you have denser and more connected networks, they are characteristic of youth who scored higher on flourishing factors like resilience and also lower on factors like mental health problems like depression. So basically, what we found was things like engagement at school or work, relationships with your peers and caregivers, neighborhood quality, and even access to the green and blue spaces around you. They were all negatively associated with depression for youth who were flourishing. But we also found that things like cortisol levels, which are a proxy for the amount of stress you're under, they were less consistently associated with this concept of resilience or flourishing, with both caregiver relationships and your access to these green and blue spaces, both showing a negative relationship with your cortisol levels. But that only occurred for flourishing youth. For youth who were not flourishing, there didn't seem to be any connections between these positive things that could actually help bring down cortisol levels. Those networks were sort of scattered and broken. So, summarizing our results, the youth who demonstrate the most positive outcomes were those exhibiting both, individual ruggedness, self-regulation, self-esteem, self-efficacy, the things we tend to most talk about when we're talking about flourishing. But there were also, for those individuals, stronger connections to the social ecologies, those spaces and places that facilitated access to the resources they needed to thrive. Engagement with educational institutions, access to recreational spaces, supportive relationships from their caregivers. So basically, that is the story here. The qualitative data supported these findings. We were able to identify a cascade effect, meaning that there were protective and promotive processes at one systemic level that seemed to have the potential to sort of, like dominoes in a circle, make other systems function better when they were strained. So when times are good or indeed bad, it seems that what goes on in our homes and our communities and our schools and our workplaces and even in the economy as a whole can offer a counterweight to how we're actually going to be doing. It's a really, sort of building or Yuri Bronfenbrenner's social ecological model, those nested systems like Russian dolls all working together. That's a bit of this research on, it was sort of the impetus for it, but on steroids. We've been sort of taking these ideas. So what this research really is demonstrating is that empirically, we can look at flourishing and understand it to be dependent on different combinations of biopsychosocial, socioeconomic, and built and natural environments that together, it's what populations interact with. And indeed, all of these factors combine to help people flourish in contexts of extreme adversity. Indeed, make one system stronger, and you might just make other co-occurring systems flourish at the same time. We need to get away from this idea that it's just about individual psychological processes. We can stimulate those processes through this cascade effect by changing the environments, changing the world around people as well. Now, just to sort of bring this fully around, there are challenges to doing this kind of research. We have to design it to include multiple systems, something that not all of us have that, we don't necessarily, we have to work across disciplines to be able to do that. Because I myself, more in the social psychology, clinical social work field, I don't necessarily understand GIS data. We have to figure out how to also robustly measure all those systems And then, of course, we have to find a way to analyze data that doesn't always sit together in one model like the ones you're actually seeing here. So our solution, of course, was to use mixed methods, multidisciplinary teams, and create innovative and sort of rely upon innovative and emerging approaches to data analysis. I think it kind of worked. So basically, that's a project, the RISE project. But our work, look, as much as I've just given you a teaser of what we're finding, the work is not yet done. My hope is that what I'm doing here is inspiring others to consider in their research, and indeed in our clinical work as well, how to think multisystemically about flourishing, and indeed to make that actually robust enough that we can demonstrate the connections between one system and another, between being rugged and being resourced, and what that's actually going to mean for us when we begin to think about flourishing. Thanks for listening, and all the best.